We are here for a case study for Bobby Kennedy for president. I'm excited. I watched the entire series. How many of you all had a chance to watch the? Yeah, okay, great, good, absolutely. Or even some of it, that's fine, that's great. I just want to let you know, it's just kind of a little bit of housekeeping. We're not going to do the normal, we're going to wait like 40 minutes and then give you guys 5 minutes to ask your questions. You can ask your questions at any point in time. I have some questions, but we all feel that we want to make this session your session. So feel free to raise your hand and I will repeat your question if you're not loud enough, but because I don't think they're going to pass a mic, so just speak very loudly. I think we'll start with the first clip. Okay, so I guess my first question, which is a question I think for a lot of filmmakers, is how did you come to this project, or did it come to you? And for Rich and Laura, how did you all come into this project?
Well, first, thanks, Leslie, for moderating. Leslie is a force in public television and in media, so thank you for everything that you do for Black public media. I was approached by, I had done a project with a German company, and they were approached by some US folks who wanted to do a film about Sirhan Sirhan, who was Bobby Kennedy's assassin, who was still in prison. And so then the Germans called me and said, we think there should be an American director. I'm not a good German accent. And so I said, well, that's interesting. So we were talking about it, and then, as I started to poke it, I didn't know Sirhan Sirhan was still alive. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. And then when we started looking at it, I said, there's not really a kind of big Bobby Kennedy film, at least in recent times, and it's coming up on the 50th anniversary. That would be interesting. So from this little Sirhan part, I said, well, I'd really like to do something about Bobby Kennedy. And then Laura and I have worked together before, and so I went to her with it. And Laura's a great producer, and she got us some development money, and we got an offer to make it a feature. But it really was Laura who said, it's a series. Let's see if we can get a series. So it's very hard, as you all know, to walk away from a bird in the hand. But I credit Laura with having that steel spine and saying, let's try and make this a series. So the second piece of it was, I used to work at ABC News, and I knew from my time there that there was a lot of footage, archive footage, that had not been digitized. So there was a lot of film that was not being used. But it had not been digitized, so it was not organized. It was not searchable, really, except that we knew that it existed. So I figured that if that was there were probably other networks with footage that had not been digitized that was out there and available. And so very quickly, discovering archive and using archive. The one thing I was very clear about from the beginning was I didn't want the archive to be background. I didn't want the archive to be a picture for somebody's story. I wanted the archive to be the story, to really try and have people brought back to that time. And if you let the archive play out, you can feel like, some of the emotion that it felt like, during those times. So the archive was really, really critical that it not be used as wallpaper pretty pictures, but that it stand on its own and be allowed to unfold as scenes on its own.
Yeah, that was really clear in the project in all 4 hours, and I think, and I mentioned this earlier, it's the reason now I understand why my mother was such a Bobby Kennedy fan, but it was because I was able to see his life play out in real time, in a sense. Laura, Rich, do you want to talk about your interest and why you jumped on this project?
Yeah, Rich, why'd you jump on this project?
I'll tell you why I jumped on this project is because Dawn called and said, I want the archival to be central on this and really drive the thing. And I said, well, you had me at I want the archival to be central. I'd worked with Dawn before, and it was a good experience. And in general, if she'd called and said, I'm doing anything, I would have been game for doing it. I've always had an interest in Bobby Kennedy in a casual way, he seemed more sincere than the rest of the family or other politicians. There had been some good docs on Bobby Kennedy, which was a little daunting. I think one of the best. I think the American Experience on RFK is one of the best American experiences. But when Dawn and Laura explained how deep they wanted to go with the archival and how they understood Bobby and like how dimensionally they saw him, it was really attractive. And the more we talked, and the deeper that attraction got, and as the opportunities, as Dawn said, that there was a lot of footage that hadn't been seen since 1968. ABC was probably our single biggest source, but we had 75 sources that we licensed from in the end, and I think about 125 that we researched in. And a lot of times that came down to a can that was on a shelf for 50 years that said RFK, and maybe a date, maybe not. Maybe it actually was RFK, maybe it wasn't. And to roll up sleeves and go into the archives at that level, and then to put it together into this kind of film was, I don't really see an opportunity to say no there. It was clearly a good project.
So why don't we show a clip or two of from the film, and we can see some of this footage. Which ones do you guys want to do? Let's see. Tour of the South. Do you want to?
Yeah. Why don't you do? Well, you want to start with educating Bobby?
Yeah, let's do that. So that's the set. That's clip 2. I'm not sure what they have up there.
Love. One of the things that I think we were able to do is to give you a sense of who Bobby Kennedy was as a person by letting him speak. Mm-hmm. And so you hear a lot in that clip. You hear how passionate he is. You hear he's willing to take on a Southern senator. But you also get a feeling of the time where it's not today, where there's so much disrespect. And so as vehemently as he disagrees, you see he still is, he pulls back a little bit in not offending, but also it was a time when Congress, as much as the conflicts were deep, they were able to do work. They were able to get work done. And that's one of the things I liked about. One of the reasons why I wanted to do this in the first place was because, like so many people, I was feeling so bereft and so cynical about politicians and government. And being immersed in this footage I was like, government can be good. There can be a person who is out there not for himself, but is literally doing his job. And so a lot of this footage exemplifies that. And I hope that in a way is like, that's what we aim for in legislators. And rather than tell you that and kind of ram that down people's throats, I wanted you to be able to see that yourself. And hopefully, these are examples of that.
Can I add something too? I think we started this project in 2015, so it was prior to the 2016 election. And as Dawn and I started developing it, we also one more note is that we worked with Radical Media, who are producing partners. And as we were developing it, we were, going into the 2016 election, and then 2016 happened, and we all as filmmakers and producers and writers and archivists and editors, I'm sure in this room, what can we do to maybe contribute to the conversation of where the country is going and how it's changing? So there was a great moment in 2016 after the election where I turned to Dawn and the team and said, this can be our legacy of sharing a story, to Dawn's point, of a leader who led, but who had an inspired and some would say even more progressive mandate and viewpoint than many politicians today, but led through action and led through his own kind of transformation. So we watched through the 4 hours of him really, transforming in his leadership from when he was his brother's attorney general to when he ran for Senate, and then his own campaign for presidency. So it's the beauty of a 4-hour also was that we were able to tell the story over a longer period. And the other thing that I think is very inspired is Dawn said to everyone, archive is driving this, but also she didn't want to interview people who were experts. She said no historians, no authors, no journalists, unless they work closely within Robert Kennedy's, whether it was as Attorney General, on his staff, or during his campaigning, or in his Senate office. So that was very, for a whole group of us that were pitching her on subjects, it was a very, I think, inspired choice, because it meant everyone in the 4-hour film or in the 4-hour series is very, very genuinely close and had been close to him. So the archive juxtaposed with the present day interviews, for us, there was like this interesting, search through the archive of, oh, look at Marion Wright Edelman, who's 20-something, in 65. We interviewed her today. It's a great trajectory.
We could show that clip.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Is there a question?
Oh, question?
It's hard to see. The lights
know.
are kind of.
Was there a question? Just raise your hand. Yes.
We
We love
forgive
the
you for
French.
that. It's looking better and better.
For archive or for the whole?
For the whole.
I'll answer. It was all funded by Netflix, which we're very grateful for. And it was, I can't give the number, but I'll say it was millions. So this is not a low budget project. And the archive was at least 1/4 of the budget, a very, very significant amount. And the beauty for us of working with Netflix was when they came on board, we knew they were taking worldwide rights, and they were our partners going, right into it. But they also knew that the project was going to be of a certain vastness, and that for us was beneficial. We didn't spend 3 years raising the money. We spent about a year, Dawn and I, developing it, and then we went to Radical, and Radical paid for some development, which was great. We did about a week of shooting. We put together a beautiful 20-minute, I call it kind of a selects reel. Dawn had chosen specific people to interview. We wrote up a 20 or 30-page, very detailed treatment with research, archive links, et cetera, and then went out to Netflix. So just as a filmmaker, if you're interested, the work in advance was very crucial to getting in the door and having them believe in the project.
It's like a year-long R&D phase to moving into production.
And I would say we had enough money to do the archival, but it meant managing it with great precision.
It was, the paying for the archive. One of the things you have to do in a budget is estimate what it's going to cost. And if you're making something over the course of 2 years, those prices fluctuate. Also, we were finding things that hadn't been licensed before. So there wasn't like a price for some things. They had to,
Right.
to figure it out. So one of the things Rich and Laura were really terrific at was going to often very small archives and negotiating a price for people who don't. So one of my favorite stories is Rich working with the local Boston, was it the news?
Yeah, the WHDH collection at Boston Public Library.
And so, I mean, you can tell more than I can, but they had Kennedy footage that they couldn't afford to digitize. That was from film. So this is great resource.
Excuse me, it was more than that. Is that they had put a moratorium on use of the footage.
Yeah, so you should tell this story.
Well, and they...
I'm just going to make stuff up.
which might make a better story.
It was from space. It was really hard.
No one
I
had
always
ever
say it was
seen
on
this.
16 millimeter film, period.
Yeah, it was 16 millimeter film from the news outtakes. It had been cataloged, but it hadn't been publicly seen. And I approached them about using it, and they had a moratorium on using this because it was so inaccessible. And we talked with them about the possibility of funding a pilot program to, for digitizing. It went back and forth. They were surprisingly receptive to that, and out of that, we were able to get access to the most crucial parts of that collection and
Which
do
is
a
now
proof of
available
concept
to
for
other
them.
filmmakers. So
Yeah,
I'm really
right.
proud of that because Netflix took a chance with us, we had to say well, we think there's something in there, but we're not sure. And, I think they appreciated that there was a reason, that we weren't just fishing, that we really that I really, really wanted it to be so archive driven that it was worth taking that chance. And so in at least 2 instances, they funded, maybe more, they funded the digitization of stuff that was previously on film, and in some cases where we did not know what was on the film.
Including personal archives of a couple of big filmmakers. D.A. Pennebaker and Chris Hedges had a collection that wasn't digitized. Jill Drew, the Robert Drew collection we went to.
Yeah, they were largely digitized, but we still did go to them and work with them. Yeah.
And Guggenheim.
And right,
The
Charles
Guggenheim.
Guggenheim's
So these
case.
were collections where, these are individual, whether they're families or individuals, and they don't have resources. So, to Don's point, we feel also Netflix have provided a service in preserving and restoring some Robert Kennedy archive footage, because all of those sources now have digitized versions of their own library.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, I think it's a good thing that the doc world can do for the archive world is offer some preservation help of creating masters or access copies to protect their material and perhaps fund some things that they can't do on their own. So, often they can, but many times they can't. And however, documentary filmmakers often complain about not having enough money, and I know that's always true, but however little it is, we tend to have more than archives do. And if we can do something grand and our noblesse oblige of digitizing some things for them, I think it does play a very a real and important preservation measure.
Okay. Can you talk about your process in terms of how do you, you're like, oh, we've got this archive, we've got all of this footage. How do you identify and find the clips of the stories that you want to bring to Dawn to inform the story? What's that? That's a mystery to me, and I just would love, and it might be a mystery to others.
Sometimes
how do you
a
go
mystery
through
to
that?
me too. It was a little different on this project because it was so big and intensive, and we had a bigger staff than usual. Usually, I work on a crew of about 4 or 5 people, and here we had a lot more. I worked a lot with. There was a core group of us that dealt with the day-to-day stuff. Me and Elizabeth Wolf, our story producer, and Brian Becker, our associate archival producer. And they're both really smart and really sharp and just generally on top of everything. And a lot of what I just heard a great line from it's attributed to Leonard Bernstein. What you need to do a project is have an idea and not enough time. And that was sort of what we had here. So in that crucible, often the way we worked was Elizabeth would express a need for something. I would find the material, and Brian would process it for what was most useful for the cut. Or the way that I said it at the time was, my job was to catch the fish, and Brian's job was to clean the fish. So we brought a lot in that way.
My job was to eat the fish.
I paid for the fish.
To that, one of the clever things about this clip that we just saw, I don't know if those of you who may not be involved in licensing footage, when you license footage from the networks, if there's an anchor or a reporter voice or image, it's double the rate. So it can get expensive twice as fast. And there was, in this sequence of Bobby walking around with a bunch of news reporters, with the first cut of that, I was like, we can't afford this because it was there. It was just like full of talent that we had to clear. So after the first cut, Brian and I went through the other networks' footage that we had that had. Which pieces of footage would work with other networks' reporters in there? So we saw Daniel Shore in this, and we got that from ABC because if we'd gotten it from CBS, it would have been twice as expensive, right? Because it was one of their guys. But ABC is not going to charge us for one of CBS's reporters. So.
It was a puzzle. Let me tell you, these are the kind of conversations that went on for
Every
almost
day,
a year.
every day,
So
yeah.
it was, I have to give credit to the whole team because it was a lot of like brain melt.
And not to be cheap, and we license a lot of footage from a lot of people, but we had to be realistic about what. Yeah,
The question?
Rob?
What was the biggest surprise you found amongst all the archival? Anything new that had never been seen?
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that had never been seen, and it's hard to. In some cases, we can identify what that is. Sometimes that's not very sexy. What it was, it just hadn't been seen, but was still important. I think one of the one good example is the Senate hearings with Marian Wright Edelman, where I was just on the. Was this the next clip? Oh, okay. I was always on the lookout for things that are especially worth bringing to the attention of the rest of the crew, and this was one piece that I found where I was listening to the Senate testimony, and I thought, God, this woman is like the best talker in the English language I have ever heard. You could just listen to her talk all day, and then from that, the rest of the crew listened to it and agreed, and we developed her as a character. I think we would have anyway, but that was how we got really tipped off to her and how good she was.
Her son, by the way, is Ezra Edelman, who made the OJ series.
Yeah.
And her husband is Peter Edelman. So when she says in that clip, so the what precedes that is this footage that we begin an hour with, because it's so, we begin a scene with, because it's just so strong. And she's very young. She's got like a bandana. She's in her 20s. Bobby Kennedy invited Marian Wright, was her name, to testify before Congress about starvation that was happening in Mississippi. And so then she invited him to Mississippi. So she's testifying. She's young. She's nervous. Today she's the head of the Children's Defense Fund, and she's quite a polished speaker. But then she was a 20-something who was working on the ground in Mississippi. So she does this. His legislative aide was a man named Peter Edelman, and so that's how she met her husband. Peter Edelman accompanied Bobby Kennedy through the South on this tour that Marian Wright led. They met, they found love, and they got married. And now she is Marian Wright Edelman, who begat Ezra.
Southern Poverty, a love story.
So when she says, I knew he was going to do something and he was going to go back to Washington, the person who went back to Washington was the man who would become her husband. And he literally demanded that the Department of Agriculture bring food into Mississippi in the 1960s. So, yep, it's a good story.
That's a great story. And there are, I'm sure that
And she had not seen that, by the way.
She'd never
So-
seen that footage.
No, nobody had seen it. So when we showed it to her, it meant a lot to her. So we actually made a clip reel for her and sent her a Vimeo link to see.
Was that the case with many of the folks that were interviewed? Like,
I think that they remembered doing or being filmed, but a lot of them hadn't. If they had ever seen it, they hadn't seen it for years and years. And that was one technique that worked really well with interviewing. So in addition to putting it in, sometimes we wouldn't use footage, but I would have the teams make a clip reel of important moments and then show that to the interviewees. So we did that with John Lewis, for example, and John Lewis has given so many interviews that he tends to tell the same stories. If you ask the same questions, people ask him about Selma Bridge or about, but showing him things that he hadn't seen brought him into the time. Yeah. And that was the case because, so it was layers in making this. So because we're interviewing only people who knew Bobby Kennedy, who worked, if you show them footage from that time, they flash back to it. And it's like if I told you to describe your 10th birthday or your high school graduation. And when people speak from memory, and they're visualizing, they react to things that they forgot. Like she reacted to her dress, just like things they've forgotten. And I think that, I hope that made it kind of a deeper, relaying of that history. Yeah, so.
Well, in just when you're talking about John Lewis, and I don't want to ruin it for anybody, but there's that moment. And I think whatever I was just like, the fact that you brought this out and he was in that moment, it's amazing. And it's just really, it's good filmmaking, but it's also a testament to your interviewing skills that you're able to bring that up.
Kahani Cooperman did that interview. I couldn't make it out, so she did that interview, and she is amazing interviewee, but we really went through and organized what questions to ask him, and then made that real. And I think then, and she was such a trooper because I was on in her ear with a phone. I wasn't asking the questions, but I was like, and make sure which is the most annoying thing. It's like, bitch, you should just do this yourself if you're gonna give me all that. But anyway, so she really, kind of, I think it also helped her. Like if you're in that moment yourself, you ask questions differently than if you're asking somebody to recite, we don't make book reports, we make films, and it's a visual medium, and you have to help people get back to the place where they can tell you those stories. So this was one way we helped our interviewees get into the mindset that I wanted.
That's great.
There's one, I'll just recount one story where it was a little reverse. We went to D.A. Pennebaker's. Dawn had done a pre-visit and said, I really want to go into the archive, but it's in their home, which is their studio. Like they have a building here in New York, and it's amazing if you ever had the honor and privilege like we have to go in to the studio there. His son Fraser Pennebaker has been very active in preserving his father's archives and legacy. So we went in as a crew, and we had the reel that Dawn had made us make, and it was perfect. And we were sitting showing him, and he was talking and being interviewed, and it was very important because he was part of a young documentary team in the 60s. Robert Drew the Guggenheim funded a team of young documentarians, Robert Drew, Pennebaker, and Albert Maysles. They were young, 20-something filmmakers with 16-millimeter cameras on their backs, shooting with Kennedy, both Robert and John. They allowed cameras in. So that was also a first, that these documentarians had followed the Kennedys, both brothers, around. So some of our footage in the 4 hours that Don selected is of that era, which is, I think, a really important era in documentary filmmaking. But what's interesting is we were showing Pennebaker footage, and he just said, oh, that reminds me of Jingle Bells, which we were all standing there going, what is Jingle Bells? And he said, oh, that's another film I shot with Robert Kennedy. And of course we were all like, what? So Fraser
Sammy
went
Davis
to Iraq,
Jr. was
pulled
with
it
them
out,
for some
exactly.
reason.
And it was a whole holiday period film following Robert.
They were like, we don't know what you would do with this.
Yeah. So I came back to the office, and I immediately phoned Rich and said, you missed Jingle Bells.
Point of order. It was before I came on because it was my greatest disappointment in this whole project, because when these guys first called me and said we're doing this project on Bobby Kennedy, my first thought was, I know where there's a super obscure piece of footage of Bobby Kennedy. It's D.A. Pennebaker's film of him singing Jingle Bells, and no one knows about this. And then in the course of that conversation, they said, we just talked to D.A. Pennebaker, and he's got this great film.
Yeah, so there was a case where the subject gave us more. Immediately, Fraser gave us, I think he gave us the 16 mil of it and said, go ahead, digitize, bring it back, please, which of course we did, and they got a version. And it was a moment.
We showed him, so talk about meta. He's filming, and then we showed him what he had filmed. So you don't really often get a chance to show the cinematographer from 50 years ago footage that he shot. So he is watching on camera what he shot, and he does this thing. My father was a photographer, and so this really resonated with me, and he goes, there it is, I saw it in the camera. He felt this way. I knew he was thinking about Jack right there. And that's the kind of memory you can't get from somebody. He and like a lot of older people, he has a really, really strong recall of older events. And so that was something that we were able to it actually worked to our advantage in this case. So.
Yeah.
That's great. Are there any questions right now? Oh, okay, one and then two.
Yeah. Well, so really, what we had these two story producers, and they did a 50-page soup to nuts from the period that we were looking at of Bobby Kennedy until his death. And then we we had that layer where we felt like, all right, we know everything that happened. And then we started collecting the archive to see how much of this is there archive for, so the archive was actually the main ingredient of the whole film series. And then, there were some big gaps in things that were not filmed or were not accessible. And only then did we layer in the interviews. And the layering was who's alive, who can talk, who had worked for him or worked with him, or had some intimate knowledge of him. So that whittles down your list a lot if you're not looking for like expert historians. But I would say the archive is really the base layer of the entire series.
Yeah, and as far as stringing that, this was an unusual. Well, we had too much material, and we had
Eventually.
Eventually, yeah, right. I never went as deep as I wanted to go on this whole topic, and we had between 400 and 450 hours of archival footage. That's a lot of material, and it's not always like that, right? I just finished working on Rob's film about Pauline Kael, and that was a matter of like doing everything we could to scrape together every piece of footage of Pauline Kael. She just wasn't in front of the camera that much. With Bobby, there was a lot. And it's mostly a chronology, so it was pretty easy to put together some string outs of different periods, and then boil those down and boil them down. And in the process of doing that, seeing what holes are still there and going back out and going fishing again. Just tacking back and forth between what we need and what we have, and what stories we want to tell and what stories we can tell. So seeing, as Dawn said, who's alive and who do we have archival of? Can we tell this story? And then just what fits. Like we had a lot of film of this Prince Edward County, Virginia, the school desegregation crisis that happened there. A lot of good coverage, but we just couldn't make it fit in the story conveniently. So a lot of good stuff had to go that way. And then a lot of it was just what worked intrinsically filmically. Like one of the first pieces I got, those of you who've seen the whole film, at the end of hour one, there's that beautiful home movie-like footage at the compound in Hyannisport, and the wind is blowing through Jackie's hair, and everything's beautiful, and the color's lush, and the helicopters are super poetic, and just everything. And I showed this stuff to Josh, and he fell in love with it. And I remember one day we were in his edit suite. He
Josh
just kept watching.
editor.
Oh, sorry, our editor. He just kept watching it over and over again. You could just see him connecting with that material, and the wheels spinning in his head of how to use it. So if we just had something that had great gravity or poetry, we tried to exploit that in the non-pejorative sense of exploit.
We had a question over here.
Yeah, I'm curious, when you're pitching to Netflix, maybe, seems like the access part of this film is a lot of archival access and even kind of not having it but knowing about it. Can you just sort of talk about how you formulate that into
Yeah, I think that's right. So the question is, networks are always asking us what's our access, and in here the access was this archival. So it's a good question. I think that we had done some development already, so we knew that there was quite a bit of archive out there. I think that they really saw the vision and potential of it. So they did kind of take a chance that it would work, and I think saying it's Bobby Kennedy, not some obscure person, if we'd gone in with an obscure person, but I knew very specifically and very confidently that, so if you think about the time period that we were going to be really, really interested in the 60s, the early 60s, the news networks were, ABC was like this upstart network. And it was doing crazy things like sending cameramen in the field to follow people around instead of doing the traditional staged packages. So I knew that was there, and pitched that we could we could access that with the right resources. So they did, though, take a leap of faith. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons, that's one of the things that is special about Netflix is, that they were kind of willing to go on a little bit of a fishing expedition about it. So it wasn't like we had it, we showed it to them, and they fell in love with Jackie's hair. Like, they fell in love with the idea that we were going to find that. And then it's sleepless nights for us actually finding it. But I felt like it was there. But you're exactly right. That was the access pitch.
I also, there was two other things, though, that in the week of shooting we did for our development, we had a couple of crucial figures, including Paul Schrade from the very beginning. That was one thing our German collaborating producers helped us with. They introduced us to Paul Schrade. They had been in email contact, and Juan Romero. So to be fair, before we walked in the door to Netflix, we had shot one day with each of them, with Paul Schrade and Juan Romero, and we'd brought them together. Those two are the most, for us, it doesn't get much more real than Juan Romero, who was the busboy who held Robert Kennedy after he was shot in the pantry at the Ambassador Hotel, and Paul Schrade was Robert Kennedy's labor union and advisor and friend, very close friend, confidant, and spent many, many years together. And Paul's alive, and he's in our 4-hour series, and he was actually on the platform at the Ambassador Hotel as they were winning.
He was shot.
And then he was shot.
Yeah.
And he was shot in the head and lived, where his best friend, as he says on camera, Bobby, died, days later. So we walked in with that access to, and their stories were very, very open and very, very intimate. So I feel like that also helped.
I think that's right. I think that showing, like, we shot those interviews the way that we hoped the archive would also play out. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? Like, the style of the interview was, here is somebody who, my friend Bob, he would tell you stories about his friend Bob, and he's a great storyteller. So they could see that this wasn't going to be a regular biopic, that there was going to be that approach. I think that's right.
There's a lot of, I've seen a lot of footage about MLK's death and people. I had never seen that before. I'd never seen Bobby Kennedy talk. And you'll see if you watch you'll watch the film, right? Everyone's going to watch it. There's a longer, that we came in sort of in the middle, but there's a lot longer. And I think what I loved is that you allowed that entire piece to play out. So you're in it. You're in that moment, and it happens again and again throughout the series.
Yeah, if I can speak to one thing about that. Most of the footage you just saw came from a few different sources, mostly the University of Georgia and from NBC. And the speech, I don't know if you call it a speech, but Kennedy talking to the crowd announcing MLK's death in Indianapolis, you can get that clip. That, to me, that's the single most moving part of the entire film. It's just so powerful when he, I don't want to spoiler alert, but he quotes Aeschylus, and it's just so beautiful. You can get that clip from a dozen different footage houses. We got it from NBC because there's about 2 seconds on the front end of it that's not on the other versions, where you hear Bobby asking someone, you don't know who, do they know about Martin Luther King? Yeah. And that is just the kind of nuance that makes film. That it's that kind of subtle grace note that just gives it the breadth and the beauty to really.
You also see him, if you, like we did spend many, many hours watching Bobby Kennedy, you start to feel like you know somebody, like all of you have experience. If you're in an edit room, you feel like you know them in a different way. And so you pick up their mannerisms. And when Bobby Kennedy's nervous, he does like this with his hair. And then right before he's announcing to Martin Luther King and he says, do they know? He starts doing the hair thing. And so there's just like, you get to see that, him as a person and not a polished, perfect, icon. And so like that really those are the kind of moments we were looking for. And that's also the beauty of a series, because you have this experience of growth over time where the audience knows that too. Like, you know, when he's mad, his voice quivers a little bit. You know, when he's nervous, he does this hair thing a lot. So,
yeah, I think one of the deep beauties of archival footage, photography, any kind of archival record is the way that it captures or represents not only the intended record but the unintended record. And there's, in that sense, there's sacred texts that you can just keep going back into and finding new meaning all the time.
I also want to say it was a privilege to work with Dawn, an African-American woman filmmaker whose voice and vision over 4 hours was very, very personal. And I think it's a view of American history that we unfortunately don't get enough of. So her perspective as a filmmaker, a former lawyer, still a lawyer, but very, very smart, detail-driven, but also from her personal experience and drawing material and upon material that I think as a country we haven't necessarily given enough attention to, was really important. And this profile of Robert Kennedy is unlike any you'll ever see because of Dawn and her filmmaking vision and the work she did to ensure that throughout the 4 hours it has a very strong point of view. So we talk about that as filmmakers. It's, I still say you have to work with directors who have a strong position, a strong point of view, and a strong creative vision. And it makes all the difference in the world. That's the difference between what I call, and I've worked on many of them, and I'm very proud of films that tend to be more, episodic, and they're nonfiction, but they have a format. This was not that. You could put these 4 hours together, and it really would be a 4-hour film. So I think that's the other thing I want to mention is a very strong and important part of this project was we all, even when Dawn was in San Francisco and we were in New York, we all would say, what would Dawn want? What would, it was very much the case. This is Dawn's film.
We had little bracelets, WW.
So we're going to play Funeral Train, the clip number 8. I love that. Yeah.
4 parts, 4 hours. How did you structure it? Especially the 4th hour, which is a little different. Can you explain that? And do you have to do any kind of recapping, considering it's 4 hours? Do you feel like by the 4th hour?
Yeah. Yeah, we didn't have to do any recapping. So what ended up happening, originally we planned to have 2 editors, and I live in San Francisco and Laura's in New York. So we thought, we'll have an editor, a San Francisco editor, and we'll have a New York editor, and we'll assign them each 2 episodes, because we knew we had 4. And then just because editors are so busy, we couldn't find anybody who was available in San Francisco. So Josh ended up editing all 4 episodes. And although I think he probably hated us,
Hate's a
it
strong word.
ended up being the best thing for the project because Josh knew every second of every hour. And so we didn't reuse any footage. We didn't, it wasn't like next time on Bobby Kennedy for President. It wasn't that. And Netflix is very specific about, so if you think about the challenge of doing a series, because I know everyone's like, I want to do a series, there's good things, but there's challenges. And one of the challenges is that each episode has to lead to the next, and then that one then has to lead to the next, and lead to the next, but also as a whole 4, they have to have an arc to the 4. So we had to not only think about how each hour would go, but also there'd be something to take away from them as a whole. And so I think, that was, and also if you think about the process of delivery, we would deliver episode 1 for initial notes, start into 2, we'd be well into 2 and like, okay, all about 2, and then notes would come back from number 1. And so we'd have to get out of 2 and go back to 1. So it was challenging, and I think just one of the things, part of what like your job is as a director is also to make the space for your editor to not be crazed, and so we started to work out what the right workflow would be for him, and he'd be like, I know what I want to do with this. Let me just do that while I know what I want to do with that. So sometimes it'd be me holding notes, because also we were across country most of the time. So
The other part of it,
Yeah.
remember, is at the very beginning, Dawn, it was November, I'll never forget, right before Thanksgiving, you were in New York, and we mapped out, and it wasn't necessarily a potential story of the 4 hours, but we mapped out Bobby Kennedy's trajectory, and Elizabeth, who we've mentioned, who's a very talented story producer. Dawn and her sat in a room for half a day and mapped out his life and just career points, because really it was all the career points. And then Elizabeth went back and did a ton of research for about a month and filled in the blanks. And then Dawn looked at that and
had
said,
an-
okay, here's the
a
story.
top line. Okay, here's what happened, timeline. But the other kind of driving principle I wanted was the story of his transformation. So it's not only the story of his life, it's actually the story of how he evolved as a politician. So, today, most people who know about Bobby Kennedy think of him as this very progressive, strong leader, the guy who's fighting for civil rights. He didn't start out that way. That was not his. So it was very important to show before, but then also to have those voices like John Lewis's voice. John Lewis volunteered for Bobby Kennedy's campaign after he got voted out of the SNCC. And so, most people don't know that. So he was very influenced by a 20-something-year-old John Lewis who was saying, you have to talk to black people. You can't just assume they're going to get your support. Same thing with Martin Luther King. And Harry Belafonte. So these people became kind of our guide to his transformation. You got Marian Wright's view. You got Harry Belafonte. So it's a layering of that story.
In the back, yeah.
A little bit. We started, in the end, there's only one.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
The question is, did we look for footage from outside America, internationally? And that's a very good question, because we did.
Yeah. The only one we ended up using was one newsreel from British Pathé. But we did go down that road, and it just wasn't fitting in.
Well, actually, no. The footage we have is of him.
I take that. Well,
yeah,
but
he's in Eastern Europe. And he went to Berlin. So here was the conversation with Netflix, which I think is a very important point for this room. They're global. They're international, and they did say, if you could provide a storyline or two that is to an international audience, that would be great. So we did the research, and he went to Europe after his brother had died, after John had been shot. He was in a period of mourning, and he was trying to decide what to do. And he says, I left the country to get some perspective, and he was thinking about what was next for him in his personal and professional life, career-wise. And he said, there's a very famous dialogue he has, and he says, with Johnson, and he says, leaving has given me a new perspective, and it was very crucial. So I think he's in Berlin, or he's in the UK,
and he goes to Africa, South Africa,
South
too,
Africa. So yes,
and Poland,
and it was also important for the story, but also for the international audience. And now, let me 30 seconds here. What's interesting,
time,
and I'm a bit of a social media nut. I stay up till all hours on Twitter. It's where I get my news. And sometimes I'll just type in Bobby Kennedy for president. It's a bit of a vanity thing. Dawn laughs at me, but I'll type it into Twitter, and boom, you see Argentina, comments from Spain, comments from Mexico, Germany is responding, France is responding, because people around the world, because it's Netflix, are watching our show, and it's been translated. It's been translated into 20-something languages, and it's very satisfying to me that people outside of the U.S. and outside of Canada and the English-speaking world are also watching it, because this is history.
All quite right. So in terms of the story, we went outside the country, but in terms of sourcing footage, all that was done with domestic footage. I found that there was some Bobby. There's some decent Bobby Kennedy footage in international archives, but not that much. The best stuff actually was here. On just about every other project, I do go to international sources more.
Do you ever use it BBC, for instance, or?
Yeah. Oh, actually, yeah. yeah, I guess there's a matter of where the archive is and where do you license it. So the BBC, I was considering domestic, but yeah, that would be international too, I suppose. Yeah.
How much of the archive is from people's personal, their personal, whatever they had in their closet, in their shoebox, or
Yeah,
whatever?
again, we thought at the beginning of the project, we were all ramped up for making elaborate spreadsheets and databases and really going deep with that. And we ended up not doing that. It sounds very appealing, and on some projects that it really is where you get the good stuff. In this case, it wasn't. We were finding that we were getting a lot of Bobby Kennedy shaking somebody's hand, or something fairly. It just wasn't that sexy for us.
Yeah, the personal collections, I think, of those filmmakers we noted.
Oh, sure.
And
but
also
I mean,
Rich went on eBay, and so did Brian Becker, and we found, remember the court sketches, which were, because cameras were not allowed in the court, so this was Sirhan's trial, and Rich found sketches from the trial that that actually do make it into, is it episode 3, I think?
Yeah,
Four?
4. Yeah, there was. Yeah, I wouldn't consider those personal archival, but they're certainly unconventional archival sources, or not your first tier.
Good question. Yep.
Actually, it's 2 questions, sorry. The translations that you mentioned, 20 languages, did you guys do voiceover? Did you just do subtitles? Was it lip sync dubbing?
It's a great question. And by the way, this is a good thing for filmmaking, just 101. I learned a lot, but we had a lot of graphics, and we fell in love with our graphics, and then we delivered to Netflix, and Netflix is like, those graphics are great, but we're going to translate these into 20-something countries, and those graphics are going to, along the bottom. So you're going to have your English graphics, and then we're going to be translating those English graphics into, and I was like, oh my gosh, we didn't know.
That's not what you said.
Yeah, I got a little furious. It was about a week of
said,
like,
"Oh,
what? I fell in love with our graphics. So that was one lesson. Don't put graphics, because Netflix does it for you internationally.
I believe it's subtitles.
Yeah, subtitles. But sorry, what was your question? I got so into
That was the first one, right?
Okay.
Okay.
Second question is specific to Rich. I've got 80 hours of footage from China in 1994 and 10,000 photographs, and I'm trying to understand where's the best place to digitize this.
What kind of
Tell them where we digitized.
Yeah, we can talk about that. But there's at a lab, and I can recommend different ones depending on.
In New York, just there was a few that we used, right?
Most of what we used was AV Geeks in Raleigh, North Carolina.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. And that's probably who I'd recommend to you.
We have about 3 minutes left. Are there other questions? Yes.
Why Netflix? Maybe you pitched to other places, but
Yeah.
other than the fact that they wanted to pay for it, it makes sense about Netflix that
Yeah.
maybe wouldn't make sense at Showtime or Amazon.
I think it could have worked at a lot of different places, and really, like, to be completely honest, like, I like working with different networks, because I think that they all have a slightly different take on what will work for different audiences. It was the first time working with Netflix, so the opportunity to work with them was really great. I also was a big fan. One of our execs was Ben Kotner, who I'm just a huge fan of his filmmaking, and I was really excited. It helps when you know you're going to get notes from somebody whose work you respond to. And he and Adam Del Deo, were our main executives, and they really, they kind of like got what we were trying to do, and their notes were really strong. I mean, they would send notes that were, and also like they were really good at, if they said, could you try X, and we would try it, and I would say, like, it didn't work. They weren't like, let me see it, let me try and make it work. Not that other people are like that, but it was just, for this, it was a good marriage of, we had the same goals. And I think it's very important, whatever partner you pick, you have to listen to what they want as much as tell them what you want to do. And, do your best to line up whatever your film is with so that you have aligning visions. And so I think that they were a really good partner for this. But I think that this could have worked in lots of places. It would have worked for HBO. We didn't go to them. It would have worked for Showtime. It would have worked for a number of places. So we were just lucky that it did work for Netflix.
Okay, are there any other questions? I have one last question. And that's because I am from the public media side.
Hello, public.
You know, and I see this and I'm like, oh my gosh, everybody, this needs to be in the schools. It needs to be, you know, people need to see this authentic telling of Bobby Kennedy's life. And so, and yet I know it's on Netflix and I subscribe. I love Netflix. I watch it. I binge all the time. But I also know that people who don't have Netflix, what are some of the ways, or how can they get to this film? How can we?
Yeah, so Netflix now has, I think that they've gotten that feedback quite a bit. They have an educational initiative. So if you're an educator, you can write to them, you get a free license, and as long as you're not charging, you can use that in schools. So if you want to do it in schools, and this, I think it's the same for not-for-profits. Like, you just have to tell them that you're going to do a public performance license. So for example, we did that at some nonprofits associated with festivals, because we didn't have a lot of time for this. Like, they wanted to just have it go up on the service before the anniversary of Kennedy's assassination, and so, but we had to finish it. So we were done, and we premiered it at the Tribeca Film Festival, and they showed, I think, 2 hours. They showed 1 or 2 hours, and then there weren't a lot of festivals. But so by the time it goes up on the service, then you have to license it after it's on the service. They can't do like a festival run, and that's another thing with series is, I think the festivals are still trying to figure out how to handle series. So, because usually they'll show like 1 hour. Well, the whole point of making a series is that you want people to see the whole thing, but then you can't ask people to stay in the theater for 7 hours. That doesn't work. So I think we're still in the infancy of how to build up publicity for a series. Anyway, people can get a public performance license if you're a not-for-profit or an educational a school, and then show it for free.
Great. Yeah, that's good to know.
We just showed it at Williams College last week, or hour 3.
Oh, wow, that's great. Okay. All right, are we? Well, okay, we're wrapping up. Do we have any other questions or is there any time? She's like, nah, it's over. Okay. All right. Thank you, Dawn, Laura, Rich.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Leslie.
everybody.
If you haven't seen the film, please go see it. Or the series, please.